Hi, everyone. My name is Gwen Stearns. I'm a debater who debated for Bard for the past 4 years and recently graduated. And today, what we're going to be doing is a brief motion analysis on the motion, this House believes that liberal democracies should ban far-right parties. So what I'm going to do is I am basically going to walk through with you how I would approach this motion in prep and some various things that could be run by government or by opposition in this motion. Just to go over quickly what I will not be doing, is so that, because I think by me going over that, that'll help you know how to use this workshop and what you can and can't take away from it. So firstly, this is not going to be an exhaustive look into the way that I would make these cases. I am going to kind of cover the broad strokes of what I would say from government or opposition, but were I to actually give speeches on these motions, there are more details that I would kind of throw in there. The point of this workshop is not to is basically not to give you an entire ready-made speech. It's just kind of to show you what the government and opposition cases look like, and really most importantly, how I would go about coming up with them. The other thing to say is that my approach to this motion is not the perfect and final approach that everyone should use. And I mean that in a couple of ways. I mean, firstly, I'm going to be giving some government and opposition cases, but these are not the only things that you could say from government or opposition. These aren't the only ways that you could win the debate from either side. You might think about this motion and come up with other ideas. And the fact that those ideas are not in this workshop doesn't mean that those are bad ideas or things that couldn't win. And that's also true with regards to how I approach the motion. You should never think that what I'm giving you is the perfect final solution to how to come up with a case. This is just a method that works for me. But it is not necessarily something that works for everybody. Certainly, this is not the way that every skilled debater goes about doing it. It is simply helpful to understand what the potential methods are, what one way of coming up with a case is, and to kind of understand my thought process. So basically, that's what you can expect from this workshop. So let's get started. On the motion, this House believes, I'm not going to be displaying this on the screen anymore after this homepage, so just to read it out loud again to make sure you have it in your head. This House believes that liberal democracies should ban far-right parties. So, step one, let me make sure my face isn't covering any of the words. Step one is to make sure we know what the motion means. This is what I try to do first whenever I get a motion that I haven't debated before, or even if I have, just to make sure I didn't misunderstand it last time. And that's probably not too difficult here, but it is often important with more complicated motions. And we'll see that even in this motion, we'll notice a couple things that are going to be very important in figuring out what to run in this debate. So the way you can go about kind of making sure we know what the motion means is to just go word by, not necessarily word by word, but kind of term by term or idea by idea in the motion, and make sure we're and just get an idea of what those words mean. So the motion starts with this House believes that liberal democracies should do something. Liberal democracies are probably just any democracy with free and fair elections. So this is North America, Western Europe, probably Japan and South Korea and a few other countries as well. So yeah, it's countries with free and fair elections, and also America, obligatory. America is bad joke. Workshop would not be complete if I didn't make it. Okay, so that's fairly easy, probably won't be controversial. Far-right parties is a little more difficult, the next part of the motion is liberal democracies should ban far-right parties. And so the definition of what a far-right party is a little more difficult, but again, it probably shouldn't be too controversial. These are parties that are usually going to be smaller. We're probably not considering the Republican Party or the Tories to be far-right parties. These are probably smaller parties that hold highly prejudicial views against groups like immigrants, racial minorities, women, LGBT people, and also that oppose a democratic system of government. if you ever have to define a kind of vague and ambiguous term like far-right parties, it can often be helpful to give some examples of what counts and what doesn't count. So I already gave a couple of examples of what doesn't count, like the Republicans and the Tories probably don't count. The AfD in Germany is probably an example of a party that does count. If you're not familiar, the AfD is a staunchly anti-immigration party in Germany who also hold a number of other fairly fairly like extreme beliefs on the far right. Although, like, not, I don't know, that might actually, now that I think about it, be a bit of a weird example because Germany already nominally does ban far right parties. But the AfD is kind of the furthest right political party I can think of at the moment. Maybe I don't know as much about Italian politics, but maybe the Five Star Party in Italy or the Golden Dawn in Greece could also be examples. So finally, the action we are doing, now that we kind of know what the nouns are, liberal democracies and far-right parties, the action we are doing is banning them. And so what does that mean? That probably does mean not letting them run for office, not allowing them to hold meetings and rallies, not allowing them to organize online, but only in the sense of a political party that is geared toward elections. So we probably can't ban people from holding or expressing far-right viewpoints, so it would still be illegal to go on the internet and say that you hate XYZ minority group if hate speech isn't banned. And it probably means we can't ban far-right groups in general, like parties implies political parties, which probably isn't the same thing as just far-right organizations. So we probably wouldn't be banning, for example, like the Proud Boys or the KKK in America. And so those groups would still be allowed in Gov's world. Although, of course, they probably, they basically, they would still be allowed under this motion. So some observations about what this means for the debate. Firstly, this debate will probably have a bigger impact in parliamentary systems like the UK than presidential ones like America. In America, which is a two-party system where the Democrats and the Republicans are really the only two parties that have a chance, there basically are no far-right parties. They exist, but they have very little influence and sway. Almost nobody votes for them. The only political parties that practically the only political parties that hold any kind of office anywhere are the Democrats and the Republicans. There are some small exceptions to that, but it's not very relevant in America. Where it will be relevant is in a system like the UK, a system like Germany, I believe Canada as well, where there are numerous different parties that all, most of them are not going to win an outright majority in party, but there are numerous parties that hold some seats. Those are the places where banning far-right parties actually matters, and where people would actually notice or care, because those are the places where before we banned them, they might have been winning elections. The other observation we might have is that this is not a debate about, as we already said, this is not a debate about banning people from discussing far-right ideas altogether, which seems obvious, but it's important to say because often in these sorts of debates, people will talk about that anyway, and people will kind of forget, kind of slip up and start talking about why it is a good thing if people can't go online and say that, XYZ bigoted opinion, or why going online and saying that opinion, why banning that opinion would cause backlash. It's very important to remember that that's not a part of the debate, and any arguments you make about that will be dismissed either by other teams or by the judges, and almost certainly result in you getting lower speaker points and probably not doing as well in the debate. So step 2 is figuring out what some clashes are. And so this is important before we go into the Gov and Op cases. And this, by the way, looks pretty similar, regardless of whether you were debating from Gov or Op. You want to figure out what the debate is going to center around. What are the important issues in the debate going to be? And maybe, like, very, very generically, what does a Gov case or an Op case look like? Not in enough detail that you would actually feel comfortable making a speech based on that, but just in enough detail to where Gov is probably going to say that this is important or that this happens. Op is probably going to say that that is important or that that happens. So how do we go about thinking of clashes? I have a couple pieces of advice. The first piece of advice is to think about general issues that are important in motions in the general topic area. So what tends to come up? So if you've debated before, what tends to come up when you debate about far-right parties? What tends to come up when you debate about banning something? The other thing to do is list everyone who might be affected by this motion, the stakeholders. Probably, if there is someone affected by this motion, there will also be a clash about like whether they are better off in Gov's world or Ops world. Sometimes they will end up not being that important, but this is a good way to try to think of clashes. So let's start with the first one. What are some general issues that are important in motions about this topic area? Well, one thing we do know is whenever there is a motion about banning something, opposition almost always has some kind of argument about how it is principally wrong to ban it because people should be free to do whatever they want, and we ought not to restrict their freedom. And so one clash could be, is it principally legitimate to ban far-right parties, or is it even principally required to ban far-right parties? This is like the kind of the Gov inverse of the principle. Do we owe it to the minorities who might be harmed by far-right parties to ban them? That could be a clash. Another thing that Op will almost always say in in debates about banning something, even more common than the principle, honestly, is you won't actually succeed at getting rid of it. You will just push it underground. And this is especially true in this debate because very explicitly we cannot ban people from expressing far-right opinions. And so it is very certain that Op will talk about what far-right people do now that they can't run for office anymore. So this is the second bullet point. Like, how will people who already hold far-right views respond? Will they keep organizing underground? Alternately, maybe Gov wants to say that they moderate. So and now let's think about like who might be affected by this motion, the stakeholders. So one person who might be affected is people who could become recruited into far-right ideology. So how might they react to this motion? Gov obviously wants to say that they won't be recruited anymore. Op probably wants to say that they will be recruited even more. Another question is, how will right-wing parties respond that aren't banned? Gov perhaps want to say that they disavow far-right parties. Op wants to say that they don't do that. Maybe they moderate to become more appealing to those former far-right voters, or they radicalize to appeal to those far-right voters. Another stakeholder might be, how does this affect the public perception of far-left parties and social movements? Since we're banning far-right parties, is that going to make anyone in our world where we've done this, is that going to make anyone think that we should start banning far-left parties too? Because it's two sides of the same coin, someone might say. So those are some questions that might end up becoming important in this debate, and those are things that you want to be aware of. You don't necessarily have to address every single one of those questions. In fact, it might end up being a bad idea too, because you don't have time to do any of them well. You probably do want to think during prep about what the most prominent clashes are going to be. But you are going to want to have those in mind, because maybe someone will say it even if you don't think it's the most important thing. And so it's important to be at least a little bit prepared for it. And so this kind of leads us then to some questions we might want to answer, because now that we kind of know what the debate is about, the debate kind of starts to take shape. And so it starts to become clear, and maybe this was already obvious to you when you saw the motion, but if it wasn't, it now starts to become clear, like what the general, sorry, it's distracting me, what the, where the general turf of the debate is going to be. And what I mean by that is like, what ground are people going to be fighting over? What are people going to be trying to prove? And so some questions we might want to answer are, what are the specific ways that far-right ideas harm people? And to what extent are they linked to far-right ideas in the political sphere? And this is important because you always want to be specific in your impacts. And so it might be important to think like, well, why are far-right ideas bad? Are they bad because they win elections and they implement discriminatory policies? Are they bad because people believe them and they commit microaggressions? Are they bad because people commit hate crimes? So on and so forth. And once you understand that, then you kind of want to steer it in a direction that is beneficial to your side. We'll get to this a little bit later when we go into the cases for that. And then the other thing that we might want to answer, and notice that this relates to several of the clashes that we just had, is what do most people in liberal democracies think of far-right parties, and how will they respond to them being banned? And so this gets into how we win the clash about how other far-right parties respond, about potential recruits into far-right ideology. We can answer those questions better if we know how different groups of people see far-right parties. Do they really hate them? Do they see them as, people who have legitimate opinions that I happen to disagree with? Having an answer to that question might be beneficial. And again, you don't necessarily want to have a detailed answer to every single one of these questions in your speeches, but having the question in mind can be helpful as you're coming up with a case. And then the last thing to just to note is, what is each team going to try to prove? And what I would say on this is that making minorities safer seems to be the strongest metric for this debate, and other metrics will most likely be outweighed by this. And so we can kind of realize this when we think about why far-right parties are bad, because regardless of the specific thing that far-right parties do, whether they get into office, or sorry, the reason that far-right ideas are bad, whether the specific reason that they're bad is that they get into office or that they just convince people that they are correct about issues, the result is the same either way, which is that minorities are harmed either by bad policies or by bad people directly doing bad things. And so what we're probably going to want to prove in this debate is that we are the side in which minorities are safer, and potentially also in which democracy is safer, because that's another feature of far-right parties, is that they tend to oppose democracy. And so most other metrics are going to be outweighed by this. So this maybe helps us see that the clash about principal legitimacy that we came up with earlier is maybe not such an important clash in this debate, because it's just very hard to picture a team winning because of it. So it's very hard to imagine Op saying that the freedom of far-right people to hold whatever beliefs they want and have those beliefs expressed in government. It's hard to imagine Op convincing us that that is principally more important than the principled right of minorities to live safe, happy lives in which they can make enough money that they're not starving. It is very hard to imagine that by any reasonable moral metric that's going to be less important than people's freedom of speech. At least in like the kind of lefty debate world, people do make that argument, but most of the people who do debate don't find it very convincing. It's going to be hard to convince a judge of that. So now that we kind of know what the debate is about and what the clashes are, now we can start going into the specific cases for each side. And I would, by the way, during prep, go through these things, not necessarily in the level of detail that we just did, not taking all of the time that we just did, but probably in like 4 or 5 minutes of prep, I would think about the clashes in the debate before I go into the specific cases. So the Gov case. So for the Gov case, the way I often approach Gov cases in policy motions, and this is definitely not the way to do it in every debate, and is not even always a good idea in every policy debate, but I do think it's a good idea here, is to use the problem solution format. What is the problem? What is the solution? So that's what I'm going to walk through here. So this slide covers the problem and the next slide covers the solution. One quick note before we do that though. If anyone here has ever seen Ashish Kumar's workshop on debate strategy, he makes a distinction between two different types of cases you can run that I think is very useful and helpful, and so I'm going to use it here. And so he talks about type A cases and type B cases. And what he means by that is a type A case is where really there's only one argument. And maybe there are other things you could say too, but they're all kind of lame. And so the example he uses is this house would ban violent video games. If you're Gov, really the only Gov argument is that violent video games make people more violent. There's not really much else to say. And so that's a type A case. And a type B case is where there are multiple things to say, where there are lots of different arguments that all of them could be winning. And so an example of a type B case might be if you were Gov on this house prefers a world without religious beliefs. that you could win on the idea that religion makes people more conservative, or that it makes people more violent, or completely unrelated, you could maybe win on the idea that religion tends to it tends to be restrictive in how people have a relationship with God, and that people have more fulfilling religious beliefs in a world without organized religion where everyone can come to their own beliefs. Either one of those is a potential way to win on that motion. That's the distinction he makes. So this is probably a type A case. There's really only one thing we can say, which is that banning far-right parties prevents bad things that happen when far-right parties exist, such as those far-right parties winning elections or more people subscribing to far-right beliefs. Those two things, like far-right parties winning elections and having influence in government, and people holding far-right beliefs, those are really the only two Gov impacts, and even the second one is a bit hard to prove. So, we'll start then by establishing the problem. The way we're going to establish the problem is we want to the overall problem in this debate is that far-right parties are bad. And this is what we were kind of covering in the last slide about the clashes. The very last thing we said, the metric is probably going to be helping minorities. And so to rephrase that a bit, the problem is that far-right parties hurt minorities in various ways. That's kind of the overall problem the debate is trying to solve. What we want to do from Gov then is to kind of establish this problem in a way that makes it so that banning far-right parties is obviously going to solve this problem. Or maybe, or not even obviously going to solve this problem, but in such a way that we can argue that banning far-right parties will solve this problem. And so we want to emphasize the bad things that happen when far-right political parties exist and suggest that far-right political parties are the source of, or at least the largest component of, the reasons that far-right ideologies are able to hurt people. And so how might we do this? Obviously, we might say that when people believe these ideas are acceptable and normal, they behave badly in everyday life. So, for example, they commit microaggressions or tolerate microaggressions when other people commit them, and even do more serious acts of discrimination, like hate crimes or like discrimination in hiring, for example. That is one reason that far-right ideologies are a problem. And we do want to acknowledge that because Op is definitely going to talk about it. And also, as we're going to see in the next slide, we can help solve that problem. However, it's worth noting that that's not the biggest problem we can solve. And the next 2 points are maybe things that we are more clearly able to solve. And so from government, we want to emphasize them and explain why they are very important and very big problems. So the next thing to say is that in coalition systems, these parties tend to push mainstream right-wing coalitions to the right. And so right-wing, big tent coalitions, when the right wants to form a government, they will often include far-right parties in their coalition, and they kind of use their influence and the fact that they are needed for the right wing to have a majority to push for things that are further to the right than moderate parties would do otherwise. So the country might be more likely to accept fewer immigrants, make it harder for trans people to access healthcare, so on and so forth. And it's important to have those examples, by the way. You don't just want to say that, the government being further to the right is generically bad. It is very important to have specific bad things that happen, because that makes it harder to outweigh you, because it makes it harder for Op to say, well, it's not really a big deal when the government is pushed to the right. You have to preemptively explain, no, it is definitely a big deal, and we really don't want it to happen. The other thing we can say is that sometimes far-right parties win big and they take control of the entire government, and that they become very popular with the masses. And even if this is very rare, it is catastrophic when it happens. This is when you get like a Nazi Germany, or like a fascism in Italy or something like that. And you can even suggest that due to the recent rise in populism, this could even happen in the West. Like, you could say, it wouldn't be that weird if it happened in the West, because we are in a context where far-right parties have, kind of unprecedented popularity. So now that we have the problem established, the next part of the Gov case is to explain why we solved the problem by banning far-right parties. And so I think there are a couple of things we can say here. So firstly, the far right loses the ability to push its ideas in the public sphere and recruit new people. And so this is why I don't think it's a bad idea from Gov to bring up even the idea that ordinary people believing in far right ideas is a bad thing. We don't just want, yes, it is not the problem that we solve the most clearly, but we don't just want to seed it to up because we can establish some change here. So for example, we might say far right ideologies. So some reasons that the far right loses its ability to put its ideas in the public sphere and recruit people is far right ideologies have now lost an organization that has lots of money to spread its ideas. It becomes harder to share far right propaganda through things like advertising or rallies. Political parties usually, it depends on the country how exactly it works, but political parties either have money from the government or are able to get donations from rich people in a way that even like other grassroots organizations can't, because when someone is running for an election, it tends to be easier to fundraise because it tends to be easier to give a compelling reason why you really need money right now, and why if you get money you can do good things. And so that means that the far right has less money that it can use to spread its ideas. Also, the far right loses media coverage. They no longer attend political debates, and their politicians are no longer interviewed leading up to elections. And so what all of this means is that far right, fewer people even know about far right ideas. And that means that there are less people who believe them. And this does explain why fewer people believe far right ideas, but it also explains why moderate right parties will just exist as moderately right parties, because when people haven't heard of these ideas anymore, those moderate right-wing parties won't be tempted to try to court those old voters because there won't be as many voters anymore. And this is also true of the second point, which is that far-right ideas lose legitimacy. Over time, people will it will be normal that these ideas are so toxic and so extreme that they should be banned. And people will see these ideas as fringe and illegitimate as a result. And Germany, despite having the AfD, is a good example, because while it took a long time for far-right ideas to resurge, there was a very long period in German history where far-right ideas were very much taboo, and it is only in the last 5 to 10 years or so that they've had any kind of meaningful resurgence. And so the result of this loss of legitimacy is that fewer people are recruited into these ideologies, and even the people who already believe them might drift away over time because they feel isolated, or they may be shamed into silence and they don't try to spread these ideas either. And so it's worth noting that what this does is it doesn't just prove benefits for Gov, it also preempts arguments that opposition could run. Because we know that opposition is going to say that these ideas are, we know this because we were discussing it earlier in the clashes section, and this is why you want to do this at the beginning of your prep before you come up with your own arguments. We know that op is probably going to say that you just push these ideas underground, and that people still believe them there, and perhaps believe them in an even more radical form. And so it's helpful to have as part of our case something that says, no, people won't actually believe these ideas in a more radical form. They're just going to stop believing them altogether because these ideas are seen as illegitimate. They can't get new recruits, and even the old people will drift away or be shamed into silence. And so this is very helpful to preempting op. So that is that is what I would say is a basic but strong government case that, if delivered well, has a good chance of winning around. Now let's look at the opposition case. So in opposition, so much like we had kind of like a format for how to do Gov, in opposition, there's going to be two parts. And again, this isn't necessarily good for every time you were opposition in a debate, but I do think it works pretty well here. So part one is going to be, this is unnecessary, and part two is going to be, this is harmful. So basically, it's the reverse of the problem solution, that Gov says there's a problem. We don't actually think there is a problem, or basically, that you can't usually say that there's no problem at all, but we're going to want to say that the problem that Gov is trying to solve is not as big as they make it out to be, and things are fine, or maybe there's some kind of alternative that will also solve the problem. Here, I don't really think there's any good alternative that that op can run, but sometimes that's something you say. And then in the next section, whereas Gov has said this solves a problem, we want to say instead of doing that, this just creates new problems and makes things worse. Quick observation before we do that, though. This is a type B case. So if you remember the typology from before, this is a case where there are multiple potential winning cases for op. And we're going to see that later, that there's not, on the next slide, I'm not just going to go over one way that op could say that this solves, that this creates problems. I'm going to go over 3 examples of things you could say, and there are also other things that I thought of but decided to cut for time, even though I am going way over time already. Sorry, Reef. Yeah. Regardless, though, of what op runs, though, we know what Gov is going to run. We know Gov is going to say that this decreases the legitimacy of far-right ideas and makes it harder for them to recruit and makes it harder for them to exist in the political sphere. And so we know that we have to either marginalize or outweigh that. And by marginalize, I mean, like, explain why it's not so important. So maybe mitigate would have been a better word there, that we need to either mitigate or outweigh this. So how could we do this? Well, we could say that far-right parties are very unlikely to win because their ideas are just unpalatable to people who have been raised to love democracy, to love pluralism. Most people aren't going to vote for far-right parties. And so what we can use this to say is that 98% of the time, far-right parties win very few seats, even in parliamentary systems, that they don't, that they maybe win 1 or 2 seats out of several hundred, that usually you can form a coalition without them. You don't need to include them in your coalition. Usually they don't have any power at all, meaning that if government wants to talk about how bad it is when these parties have influence over the government, we don't think that ever happens. Another thing you can say is that, and so that was kind of a mitigatory thing. Now this one is kind of an outweighing thing. You can say it is more important to stop people from, that basically political parties aren't the main way that far-right ideas spread. That if we want to stop the spread of far-right ideas, it is more important to stop their spread through things like social media than it is to stop their spread through politicians, because they don't normally spread through politicians anyway. They tend to spread through grassroots means on social media, and this is potentially a reason that like the money and exposure that Gov talks about is not so important. We can say that politicians can be older and difficult to relate to, and most people get their worldview from what they see on their social media feeds rather than what politicians say on the news. So the next step is this is harmful. And as I said, I am not going to be covering an exhaustive list because there are many, many things that op can say as to why this is harmful. In fact, it might be a good exercise to think of some other things that I didn't include here because there are definitely others. And so that's important to be aware of during prep because you want to decide what you're going to run. Are you going to run just one of these things? Are you going to run multiple? What are you going to do? How many you run often depends on whether you're opening opposition or closing opposition. If you were opening opposition, you want to run a lot of them because you want to take away ideas from closing opposition. You want to make it as hard as possible for them to extend. And so if you take all of the obvious ideas, then they don't have anything. If you're a closing opposition, you don't need to worry about anyone extending off of you. So I often find that it's a better idea to run just one point from closing opposition and to do that point very, very well. And to explain why that one thing is the most important thing in the round. If you try to run multiple things, you often run out of time. You often don't get to everything you might want to say, and that's often not as useful or helpful to do. However, even if you are opening opposition, you might not want to run all of these. And the reason is, one, if you run too many things, you often can't do any of them well, and so you don't end up getting credit for the good ideas that you had. But secondly, some of these ideas contradict each other. And that's something you find that you kind of have diverging paths that you can take to winning from one side of the motion. And I'll highlight where that is, but obviously, and this is something that teams neglect a lot. You want to be very, very careful not to run contradictory points. You want to make sure that all of your ideas are consistent with each other. So, how do we do? So, what are some things we could run? hold on, I just need 1 second. Okay, now I should be audible again. All right, sorry about that. My girlfriend was locked out of the apartment and I had to let her back in. All right, so what are some things that we could say, use from Opt to say that it is harmful to ban far-right parties? So here are 3 examples. So firstly, we can say that basically this makes people who hold far-right ideas feel censored, and it basically creates the narrative that far-right ideas are being unfairly like censored or suppressed. And that, you know, the left isn't even willing to hear us out. They can't even have a reasonable conversation with us, and that far-right parties are under attack, are now victims of something. And so this makes the right look more sympathetic potentially to average people. The right can spin this in such a way that they can say, look, we're the victims of repression. We need help. You know, we're just ordinary people trying to express our beliefs like anyone else, and we're under attack. And so that could make it easier for them to recruit average people, because those average people now feel more sorry for them or learn more about those far-right parties when they kind of have a reason to look into it and like, you know, understand why they're being suppressed. This also could make people who already believe in far-right ideas more dedicated to the cause. So if you think that your ideas are under attack and that there is a pressing need to you know, that there's like a pressing need to defend yourselves, this maybe makes you more active. You're more likely to go to rallies. You're more likely to join these organizations outside of political parties. You're more likely to be active on social media. So that's one bad thing that could happen. The next thing is that far-right ideologies could become more radical because now they don't have to appeal to voters as much. So we could say, for example, that politicians want things like donations from and connections with wealthy people. How much they want these things depends on the country. Many Western, you know, many liberal democracies have made it difficult or impossible for rich people to donate to political campaigns. However, not all of them have. And like this, much, you know, I dunked on America earlier, but it's not true that only in America is wealthy people influencing politics a problem. Even in, you know, I would say that in most Western democracies, politicians do benefit, or sorry, in most liberal democracies, politicians do benefit from being connected to rich people for one reason or another. And they also want to be able to do things like do interviews with respectable and mainstream journalists. They want the ability to join right-wing coalitions. So all of these things mean they don't want to be too toxic and extreme. And so they tend to do things like discourage and disavow violence and make their ideas a little less radical and more palatable. Whereas if they can't run for office, they begin to focus more on direct action. And so you can say, even if they're smaller, they do worse things, that they were never large enough to really win political office, but when they're smaller and they don't even try to win political office, now they have nothing to lose from being violent. Now they have nothing to lose from committing hate crimes. Now they have nothing to lose from spreading the most radical ideas imaginable and convincing people that those radical ideas are a good idea. A third thing you could run is the idea that this will radicalize mainstream right-wing parties. And so you could say that right-wing parties. So basically, what will happen as a result of this motion is that there will be a bunch of far-right voters who now have no one to vote for, who previously liked this one party, and now that they can't do that anymore. And so right-wing parties who are more moderate might want to try to capture those voters. And obviously they can't become radical enough that they themselves would get banned, but they might try to become more radical to try to capture the voters, you know, whoever they can who was previously voting for these far-right parties, meaning that they adopt stronger anti-minority stances or respect democracy a little less. And these mainstream parties probably have a much greater chance of success than explicitly far-right parties who tend to be comparatively fringe. And so it's probably a very bad thing if these more mainstream, more successful parties become more radical because they want to appeal to far-right voters. So I said that I would highlight where there's a contradiction between these 2 points, and I forgot to do it earlier. But what it is there's a contradiction between these first 2 points here, where on the one hand, like the first point says grassroots, far right parties recruit more people, and then the second one is they don't try to recruit people as much, and they just try to do whatever they can with the people they have. That's not like the biggest contradiction in the world, but if you're not careful, you can make it into a contradiction. So that's why it's not necessarily a good idea to run both of these points. Okay. So that's all I had to say on this motion. I say that's all, like I didn't say very much. I went like twice the time I was supposed to, but that's what I have to say on this motion. I think I hope you found this helpful. My name on Facebook is Gordon Stearns. If you have any questions, I would be happy for you to reach out to me, and I would be happy to discuss this motion further with you. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned a lot. Thank you for watching.